everybody. This is Mr. Ernest, and today we're talking about suffrage in the UK, particularly women's suffrage. However, in order to understand the suffrage movement, we do have to understand what was suffrage like before women achieved the right to vote, or even began fighting for it. Earlier on in English history, monarchs really only consulted the public as they saw fit, and it was still only wealthy people who had a say in anything. But in 1215, the Magna Carta is signed, and it requires monarchs, kings, and queens to consult wealthy landowners before they establish new laws and taxes. And so, over time, these groups of wealthy nobles, and also clergy, by the way, who made up the great councils that monarchs would consult with, became known as parliaments, which is what Great Britain has today. And those parliaments today look a lot different, but at the time it was mainly still nobles and clergy, but who had to be consulted rather than just by the choice of the king. It wasn't until 1430, though, that official property value requirements were put into place to decide who could vote on a member of parliament to represent them when they went and talked to the king. So in 1430, the 40-shilling freeholders were established, and that meant that you had to have property valued over 40 shillings. All right. Before I continue, just a point of note about who could vote. In the UK, restrictions on voting were pretty much just restricted to property ownership and tax-paying status. Like, you had to have a certain amount of property, you had to pay a certain amount of taxes. Never actually about race. So even as early as 1774, there's evidence of black people being able to vote. The first known black man who voted in the UK was Ignatius Sancho, who was a shopkeeper in the UK. Still, though, when it comes to when it comes to non-white people, they're all excluded generally because they have this because they have the same problem that the majority of white males also have. They don't have enough property, they don't have enough right to ownership of anything to allow them access to vote. All right, there's a lot of information in this PowerPoint, so if you end up working with the UK for the project next week, you can come back to it. But for right now, I'm just going to go over the broad strokes. Elections in the UK were considered to be pretty corrupt and dirty, and they needed to be cleaned up. Bribery was a problem. Rich people coercing lower class people into voting the way that they wanted to was a problem. There's no secret vote, so you could be fired or evicted based on who you were voting for. And so they passed the 1832 Representation of the People Act, also known as the First Reform Act. And that does a few things. It gives more landowning men the right to vote, but still excludes the vast majority of men. But it does another thing too, which is defines the voter as a male person. So up until now, mostly women cannot vote because mostly they can't own property. But a few people did. A few women managed to vote based on property and tax requirements. So this put a stop to that. Following that First Reform Act, working class men are really frustrated because A, there's all those other problems that are there that elections have in the UK, but also B, they're all shut out from voting. And so they start a movement called the Chartist Movement, or the Chartism Movement, to push for more reforms. And there were about 6 goals that they had in particular, but of those 6, the 2 that I focus on are the secret voting and universal male suffrage. They wanted every man to vote and for everybody's vote to be secret. 2 more reforms pass, and still all but 40% of men can vote, but women are still fully excluded from parliamentary voting. Not only are they excluded, but because politics is considered too chaotic, too immoral for women, it's inappropriate for them. They really have no political power at all. That changes with industrialization because, as we talked about in the industrialization or industrial revolution unit, women are now working long, hard hours in factories, but they're also meeting with other women and discussing social issues. And one of those social issues that they meet and discuss and decide to do something about is slavery. So, abolition of slavery, to be specific. By 1772, slavery is illegal in England, but it still is active in England's colonies. And women decide to get involved in the efforts that had been started to end that. So they can't vote, they can't petition anybody, but they can write stories, they can write poetry to convince influential men in their lives. And their efforts are successful. They end up managing to lead a boycott of about 300,000 people in the UK of sugar produced on plantations. So slavery, sugar produced through slavery. But still, it's considered inappropriate for them to get involved in politics. Now, they were able, at some point, like the culture changes, they have the ability to sign petitions. Just there's a cultural shift that happens. But even that is worrying to people like William Wilberforce, a person who was sympathetic to the abolition movement, but suspicious or not certain that of women's involvement in politics. And he said that he feared it would be to mix them in with all the multiform warfare of political life. Even Queen Victoria said, "We women are not made for governing. And if we're good women, we must dislike these masculine occupations." All right, Queen Victoria. So, having been involved, though, in these abolitionist societies and having gotten accustomed to more political influence, they really feel like they should have access to more leadership roles, particularly in the abolitionist movements that continue on even after England or the UK abolishes slavery in all of its colonies. They set their sights on global abolition. But men are still shutting them out of leadership roles in those movements. So their efforts turn towards women's rights and particularly women's suffrage. All right, so by the 1850s, there are so many more women-only abolitionist societies because they couldn't get leadership roles in the ones that men had started, that they realized we don't actually need men to lobby Parliament for abolition. We can do that on our own. And they start working with abolitionists in the US because that was where they were focusing on ending slavery, at least in the 1850s. So they're talking to and working with abolitionists in the US, African American women who were working on abolishing slavery, and inviting them over to talk in the UK. And so they share ideas, they work to help each other, and they end up signing this petition. 1,500 women in particular in London signed this petition to add women's suffrage to that second reform bill that passed in 1867. But it was not successful. It was rejected. Still, though, they push on. But this movement gets so popular that the men who had been working for universal male suffrage end up turning their focus on helping women gain suffrage because they felt like if we can get women to have the right to vote, then certainly all men are going to also be able to vote. The different tactics that they take in order to do that. We talked briefly about the fact that the suffragists are different from the suffragettes. Millicent Fawcett, who is not pictured on this slide, led the largest of the suffragist movement. They had tactics that were more like signing petitions. And that didn't mean just petitions and then we turn it in somewhere. That's actually a petition, that's a way of being involved in government, petitioning the government, petitioning a parliament. So they're able to sign petitions. They have meetings in public and private homes, private homes and in public. They publish literature to spread information and spread awareness and convince people. But for decades, those tactics don't work. They don't have suffrage by 1903. And so people like Emmeline Pankhurst decide enough is enough. This isn't enough. We're going to do things a little bit differently. And she founds with her daughters the Women's Social and Political Union. And they do things like burn down churches, break windows, chain themselves to rails outside of government offices, march. They also do things that are a little bit less violent, like evading the census. So in this example here, you can see where Louisa Burnham has written, "No vote, no census. If I am intelligent enough to fill in this census form, I can surely mark an X on a ballot paper." And although they are involved in violent acts, they are also treated violently. In this case, in the Black Friday demonstration on November of 1910. So when we say that the fight for suffrage was like people fought tooth and nail and they died for it, like people literally were beaten and end up dying over getting the right to vote. So suffragettes get imprisoned for the militant tactics that they take. They're force-fed. They have to be released from prison so that they can recuperate and then come back because it was such a bad look on the country that women were wasting away in prison. But things kind of slow down with the onset of the First World War. So their efforts have to be suspended or abandoned entirely. But some women still continue on and lobby politicians discreetly. And in 1918, they get finally the right to vote for women over 30 who meet the property requirements or who are married to a man who meets the property requirements. But the Chartists were right, or at least the universal male suffragists were right. They did all get the right to vote for men over 21. But in 1928, after another decade of pushing on, universal suffrage was extended to all women, including, all women over 21, as it was for men over 21. And just as a side note, the voting age in the UK was lowered to 18 in 1969.